The stars above Middle-earth had always been trustworthy things. Elves had mapped them with the patience of immortal minds across ages that made human history look like a footnote. They were fixed points in a world where so much else had proven treacherous, where rings of power could corrupt the greatest intentions, where the most beautiful music could birth the darkest shadow, where a single moment of mercy could save the world or doom it depending on which moment you chose and which mercy you extended. The stars were constants. They did not move in ways that suggested hunger. They did not reconfigure themselves into patterns that communicated biological imperative. They did not fall until they did. The first sign was not visible from the ground. It was felt in the deep places of the world where things that paid attention to the fundamental frequencies of existence registered disturbances that had no precedent in any memory, and memory in Middle-earth was very long indeed. Tom Bombadil paused in his singing and looked upward through the canopy of the old forest with an expression that no one was present to interpret. The Ents of Fangorn stopped their long, slow conversations and turned their ancient faces toward a sky that felt different without being visibly different. In Lothlorien, Galadriel stood at her mirror for 3 hours without moving, watching something in its depths that she did not describe to anyone afterward, and when she finally stepped back, her face had the quality of someone who has seen a future and recognized that the usual tools for addressing futures are not going to be sufficient. In the deeps of Mirkwood, spiders that had terrorized travelers for generations felt something arrive in the air that made them retreat to the furthest corners of their webs and refuse to emerge. Spiders understand hunger in its most fundamental form. What they sensed in that changed air was a hunger so total that it made their own appetites seem like mild preferences by comparison. The first impact happened in the northern wastes beyond the Grey Mountains, in a region so remote that only eagles witnessed it, and even they had to circle twice at altitude before they trusted what their extraordinary eyes were telling them. Something came down from the sky in pieces, burning as it fell, each piece the size of a small hill. They were not rocks. Rocks did not move after landing. Rocks did not split open with the deliberate purposefulness of seeds cracking to release what they had been carrying across the void between worlds. Rocks did not disgorge creatures that immediately began to feed on everything within reach with the systematic efficiency of things that have been bred for exactly this purpose and have been hungry for exactly as long as the journey took. The eagles turned south toward Rivendell with the speed of urgency. What had arrived was ancient in the way that predators are ancient, older than any civilization it would ever consume, carrying in its collective biological memory the extinction of worlds so numerous that Middle-earth's relatively modest history of wars and dark lords and rings of power did not register as context. The Tyranids had no concept of Middle-earth as a place with history and significance, and peoples who had made sacrifices worth remembering. They had the concept of biomass. They had the concept of consumption. They had the concept of the hive mind, which reached across the vast silence between stars with the patient certainty of appetite that has never learned to doubt itself because it has never encountered anything capable of making it doubt. They had encountered resistance before. Every world resisted. Resistance was simply the final stage of the consumption process, the part where the biomass attempted to preserve itself before becoming part of what consumed it. The hive mind found resistance interesting only in the tactical sense, as a problem to be solved with the precision of biological engineering refined across more extinctions than any mind in Middle-earth had the numbers to count. But Middle-earth was not an ordinary world. This was a world where language had power in the literal sense, where the right words spoken with the right intention by the right speaker could accomplish things that no biological weapon could achieve, where music had built the fabric of reality, and the echoes of that music were still present in the structure of every stone and every stream and every breath taken by every creature that walked its surface, where the divine was not a metaphor or a comfort, but an active participant in the world's unfolding, and the divine had opinions about what was happening and the capacity to act on those opinions through instruments they had spent ages preparing. The first Tyranid organisms that moved south from the impact site in the northern wastes were Hormagaunts, biological shock troops whose entire existence had been optimized for the single purpose of overwhelming defensive positions through sheer numbers and the specific horror of watching them come and come and come and continue coming regardless of what you did to the ones in front. They moved through the northern reaches of Rhûn with the efficiency of a biological tide, consuming everything organic and beginning the process of digestion that would eventually seed the ground with the spores that would prepare it for the next stage of the consumption. The first people they encountered were men, the hardy inhabitants of the regions near the Grey Mountains who had survived everything the North had thrown at them through centuries of difficult existence. They were brave in the way that people are brave when bravery is the only alternative to dying badly, and they fought with the weapons they had and the courage they had built through generations of living at the edge of things. None of it mattered. The Hormagaunts did not respond to courage. They did not respond to skill. They responded to obstacles by going around or through them with the single-minded purposefulness of organisms that have been designed to consume rather than to fight. The distinction mattering because fighting implies that the opponent has standing and consumption implies that they do not. The survivors fled south with the specific urgency of people who have seen something that cannot be explained and cannot be survived by anyone who stays to try. Their reports, arriving at various settlements and eventually at Rivendell and Rohan and Gondor, were confused in the way that reports of genuinely unprecedented things are confused, because the witnesses had no framework for what they had seen and were trying to describe it in terms of things they knew. Giant insects was one description. A tide of hunger was another. The world ending in the north was a third, offered by a man who had lived through 3 wars and had not previously been given to dramatic statements. Elrond assembled a council with the speed that the situation demanded rather than the deliberation that councils usually preferred. The message had already gone to Lothlorien and to the halls of Minas Tirith and to wherever Gandalf was, which was a location that Gandalf's friends had learned not to rely on being able to predict. The wizard arrived before the message did, which was characteristic, with an expression suggesting that the stars he had been watching for the past week had been telling him something that he had hoped they were not telling him. "What comes?" Elrond asked, and Gandalf answered with the specific honesty of someone who has decided that the situation has moved beyond the point where softening the truth is a kindness. "Something that has never been opposed by anything available to us," Gandalf said. "Something that does not want what Dark Lords want. Sauron wanted to rule. Morgoth wanted to remake. What comes wants neither of those things. It wants to consume and then move on. For it, we are not subjects or enemies or even obstacles in the meaningful sense. We are food. The distinction matters," Elrond said. "Enormously," Gandalf replied. "Because every tool we have developed for opposing evil was developed against evil that has something it wants to preserve, something it fears losing, something that can be threatened or promised or appealed to. Dark Lords have pride. Dark Lords have plans. Dark Lords have lieutenants who can doubt and subordinates who can be turned and vulnerabilities that emerge from the gap between what they intend and what they are willing to sacrifice to achieve it. What comes from the north has none of these things. The Hive Mind does not doubt. It does not have subordinates capable of independent decision. It does not have pride because pride requires the capacity to imagine being seen by others as lesser, and the Hive Mind has never encountered anything it considered its equal. The Council considered this in the silence of people absorbing information that requires reorganization of everything they believed about the nature of the threat they face. "What can be done?" someone asked. Gandalf looked at the fire for a long moment. "We find out what we are made of," he said. "Which is what this world has always done when faced with things it did not know how to face. We discover our nature by finding out what our nature is capable of when it has no alternative. The Hive Mind, extending its tendrils of psychic connection across the northern reaches of Middle-earth, encountered something it had not encountered before. Not resistance, which was familiar. Not power, which it had faced in various forms. Something older and stranger and more fundamental than either of those things. The world itself had a quality that the Hive Mind's biological sensors could detect but could not classify. There was something in the fabric of Middle-earth that did not respond to the Hive Mind's psychic presence the way that the psychic fabric of other worlds had responded. Other worlds had simply been overwhelmed, their local psychic resonances consumed by the shadow and the warp that traveled with the Tyranid fleet. Middle-earth's psychic resonance did not overwhelm. It pushed back, not with aggression, with presence. The music of the Ainur was not a metaphor. It was the actual structure of the world, woven into every stone and every stream and every breath of wind that moved through the leaves of the old forest. The Hive Mind's shadow, which had extinguished the psychic light of 1,000 worlds by simply arriving and absorbing everything that thought or felt or believed, pressed against this structure and found that the structure pressed back with the specific quality of something that had been made rather than merely existing, made by intelligence and intention, and the particular kind of love that builds things to last rather than to endure. The shadow could not understand what it was encountering. Understanding was not its instrument. It probed further, extending itself into the psychic fabric of Middle-earth with increasing pressure, and the fabric resonated in response. In Lothlorien, the trees glowed with a light that had no source. In Rivendell, the waterfalls sang in a register that the elves had not heard in the Third Age, and that the oldest among them associated with moments when the Valar had reached down through the barrier between their realm and Middle-earth to touch what they had made. In the Shire, where Hobbit sensibility prevented most residents from noticing anything as abstract as a change in the world's fundamental resonance, the flowers bloomed in colors that had not been seen since the Elder Days, and old Gaffer Gamgee told his son that the ground felt different underfoot, as if it was paying attention to something. The Valar were not indifferent. They had been accused of indifference before, and not without cause. The history of Middle-earth was full of moments where those who suffered the most had prayed for intervention that did not come in the form they needed when they needed it. But the Valar operated on a timescale and with a set of constraints that made their apparent indifference look like something other than what it was, which was profound attention combined with profound respect for the freedom of the things they had made to determine their own fates. They could not simply solve every problem that arose without destroying the very thing they were trying to protect, which was not Middle-earth as a physical location, but Middle-earth as the place where beings of their making exercised the freedom that made them worth making. What arrived from the stars was different. What arrived from the stars was not a test, or a consequence, or a darkness that had its roots in choices made within the world. It was an external appetite that had nothing to do with freedom or consequence or the long drama of souls working out their relationship to the good. It was simply consumption, and the Valar, watching it move southward through their world, recognized that their usual approach of working through instruments and allowing events to unfold according to the choices of the free peoples was insufficient for an opponent that did not participate in the drama of choices. Manwë, whose domain was the heirs of the world and who saw everything that moved under the open sky, spoke in the Council of the Valar with the specificity of someone who has finally encountered a situation where the rules that governed their involvement require reinterpretation. The rules existed to protect freedom, he said. What approaches does not threaten freedom, it threatens existence. The protection of freedom requires that there be beings capable of freedom. We are not intervening in a drama of choices. We are protecting the stage on which that drama occurs. The eagles were the first instrument. The greatest of them, whose wingspan could shadow a hill, descended on the Tyranid vanguard in the northern passes with the specific ferocity of creatures who had been watching the world from above for ages and had developed strong opinions about what was permitted to happen in it. They found the Tyranids difficult in ways they had not anticipated. The organisms below did not rout. They did not break. They turned their faces upward and began to evolve in real time, the hive mind processing the nature of the aerial threat and beginning to grow organisms designed specifically to address it, hive tyrants extending their psychic influence skyward, gargoyle bioforms rising from the advancing mass with the casual efficiency of a system that had faced aerial threats on 1,000 worlds and had libraries of biological responses available. The eagles fell back with losses they had not expected and a new respect for what they were facing. In Rohan, King Eomar assembled his riders with the speed of a people who had been born on horseback and understood urgency in their bones. The reports from the north had been impossible to fully process, but the quality of the fear in the survivors' faces was a language every warrior could read without translation. He rode north with 10,000 riders, the thunder of their passage a statement of intent that Middle-earth had always made when darkness moved. We come. We do not wait for it to reach us. We ride out, and we meet it, and we answer it with everything we have. The Rohirrim met the Tyranid advance south of the Anduin's northern tributaries in a valley where the geography should have favored cavalry, where the ground was open enough for the horses to build speed and firm enough to sustain the charge. The Hormagaunts did not respond to the thunder of hooves the way that orc armies responded. They did not break formation. Formation was not a concept they had. They moved as a biological fluid, flowing around obstacles and filling every available space with the systematic purposefulness of a tide covering a shore. The Rohirrim's charge broke on them the way that waves break on a beach that simply absorbs the impact and remains. The horses fell. The riders fought on foot when the horses fell. They fought until they could not fight, and then they retreated because Eomer had learned from Helm's Deep that retreat is not defeat when retreat preserves the force that will be needed later. They pulled back to the Anduin with the Tyranid tide flowing steadily behind them, not pursuing with the specific hunger of a predator chasing prey, but advancing with the indifferent certainty of a process unfolding according to its own internal logic, regardless of what stood in its path. The Anduin was the first line that held, not because of military organization or fortification, but because the river itself was part of the world's structure, had been part of it since the making, and the world was pushing back. The Tyranid organisms that entered the Anduin found the water resistant in a way that water should not be resistant, as if it had opinions about what was permitted to cross it. Some crossed anyway because the Hive Mind applied enough biological pressure to overcome any individual obstacle, but the crossing cost more than crossings had cost before, and the organisms that emerged on the southern bank were fewer than those that had entered the northern bank. In Minas Tirith, Faramir organized the defense, with the clarity of a man who had studied war long enough to understand that the principles of defense do not change even when the nature of what is being defended against changes completely. You find what slows the enemy. You make them pay for every meter. You preserve your strength for the moment when strength will be the difference. He did not know yet what would be the difference against this particular enemy. He knew only that he intended to be present at that moment with enough strength remaining to use it. The Ents moved. Treebeard had been deliberating, which was his natural mode and which usually required much longer than the situation allowed. But the Ents had an older relationship with the world than any other speaking creature in Middle-earth, older than the elves by the accounting of some histories, and what the Ents felt in the changed quality of the world's resonance was not something that required deliberation. It was something that required action with the specific urgency that Ents almost never felt and always recognized when it arrived. They came south from Fangorn in numbers that had not moved together since Isengard, their passage through the forests of Rhûn preceded by a sound like the world itself clearing its throat. The trees moved with them, or moved for them, or were moved by the same current that moved them, the distinction between these possibilities not mattering because the result was the same. The northern forests became active in ways that the Tyranid advance had not encountered, and the Hive Mind, which had consumed worlds covered in vegetation without ever encountering vegetation that had opinions about being consumed, found itself in unfamiliar territory. The Tyranid organisms began consuming the Entish forests in their methodical way and discovered that the forests did not simply die. They fought back. Not in the way that creatures fight back, which is the only kind of fighting back that the Hive Mind's extensive biological libraries contained responses for, but in the way that very old and very willful things fight back when their existence is threatened, which involves the world itself taking sides. Treebeard reached a Carnifex, one of the enormous armored Tyranid bioforms that served as mobile fortresses of destruction, and wrapped his arms around it with the specific strength of something that has been alive long enough to develop muscles that do not work on the timescale of muscles, but on the timescale of geological processes. The Carnifex's considerable armament tore at bark and ancient wood, and found that bark and ancient wood were more resilient than ceramite equivalent. Biological armor when the bark and ancient wood in question were animated by something older than the Tyranid race's entire history of consumption. The Carnifex died. It took a long time and it damaged Treebeard significantly, and the Hive Mind immediately began the process of growing larger Carnifexes, but the principle had been established. There were things in Middle-earth that could not simply be consumed. Gandalf arrived at the front south of the Anduin with the white riding Shadowfax, the horse that was more than a horse running at speeds that made the ground seem to cooperate with the passage rather than merely permit it. He had been in the north in the days since the council, not fighting because fighting was not yet where he could be most useful, but watching and learning and understanding the nature of what he faced with the specific attention of a Maya whose purpose was wisdom, and who had learned over the long ages that wisdom was not knowledge, but the understanding of how to apply knowledge at the right moment. He had seen the hive mind. Not directly, because direct perception of the hive mind was something that broke most psychic contacts that attempted it, but he had felt its edges in the way that one feels the edges of a very cold thing without touching it, and what he had felt had told him what he needed to know. The hive mind was ancient and vast and utterly without the qualities that made darkness in Middle-earth vulnerable to light. It did not fear. It did not hope. It did not love or hate or desire anything that could be offered or threatened. It was appetite expressed as biology expressed as intelligence, and the intelligence served only the appetite, and the appetite served only the hive mind, and the hive mind served only the imperative of consumption that was its entire nature. But the hive mind was also, Gandalf had observed, confused. Not confused in the way that could be exploited tactically in the ordinary sense, but confused in the way that any system is confused when it encounters inputs that its extensive experience has not prepared it for. The world's resonance was doing something to the hive mind's psychic presence that the hive mind could not classify or address with its usual biological solutions. The music was not a weapon, but it was affecting the shadow, the way that a constant vibration affects a structure built without accounting for vibration, not breaking it, but stressing it in ways that accumulated over time. Gandalf raised his staff at the front, and the light from it was the light that it had always been, the light of his order, the light of his purpose, the specific quality of illumination that had been entrusted to him by those who had sent him to Middle-earth for exactly this kind of moment. The Tyranid organisms nearest him recoiled from it in a way that the hive mind immediately assessed and began to develop countermeasures for, but the recoiling itself told him something important. The biological entities of the hive mind were not immune to what Middle-earth was made of. They could be affected by it. The shadow in the warp could be stressed by the music. The organisms on the ground could be troubled by the light. They were not invulnerable. They were simply vast. And vastness required a different approach than the approach that had been developed for defeating darkness that had a center and a source and a weakness that could be found and exploited. The One Ring had been the key to Sauron because Sauron had poured his power into it, and destroying it destroyed the foundation of everything he had built. The hive mind had no ring. It had no single point of vulnerability. It was distributed across every organism in the fleet and every organism on the ground and the fleet itself, which was still arriving from the void above. But the fleet was still arriving. And the void above Middle-earth was not the void above ordinary worlds. In the halls of the Valar, Manwë had made his decision, and the decision had been made with the full council, which had not agreed quickly or easily because decisions of this magnitude in a world built on the principle of freedom required the specific quality of agreement that came from genuine conviction rather than authority. What they agreed was this: the barrier between Valinor and Middle-earth had always been meant to protect freedom. Now it was in danger of serving the opposite purpose by allowing freedom's existence to be ended before it had run its course. The protection of the principle required the temporary suspension of the usual means of protecting it. The Valar reached into the world, not in the way that they had worked before, through instruments and slow influence and the long patience of those who trust that the good they have planted will eventually grow. They reached in with the directness that they had used in the wars of the First Age, before the principle of freedom had been established as the primary mode of their relationship with Middle-earth, and what they brought to bear against the Tyranid fleet, still arriving through the void, was the full weight of what they were, which was something that the hive mind's extensive libraries of consumed worlds had no category for. Tulkas, whose strength was the strength of the world made physical, reached into the fleet with a force that expressed itself in physical reality as gravitational anomalies of impossible specificity, targeting bioships with the precision of someone who knew exactly where every ship was because he could feel the world's pain at their presence. Varda, who had kindled the stars and knew the void between them as intimately as the hive mind knew hunger, reached into the shadow that traveled with the fleet and met it with the light that had been present before the shadow and that the shadow had never encountered in its natural form. Not the light of stars that the shadow had simply consumed or avoided, but the light that had made the stars, the first light, the light that existed in the moment when the music first generated form from intention. The shadow recoiled, not destroyed, not broken, but pushed back in a way it had never been pushed back. The psychic connection between the fleet and the organisms on the ground suddenly stressed in ways that the Hive Mind's distributed intelligence began to struggle to compensate for. The organisms on the ground, cut off from the full quality of Hive Mind connection that they depended on for tactical coordination, began to behave with the specific confusion of components of a system that can no longer fully communicate with the system they belong to. On the ground, the Free Peoples recognized the change before they understood its cause. The Hormagaunt tides faltered in their coordination. The larger bioforms hesitated between objectives with the hesitation of things that have been receiving constant instruction and are suddenly receiving static. The Hive Tyrants, whose psychic power was the local expression of the Hive Mind's will, strained visibly under the effort of maintaining coherence without full connection to the shadow, their physical forms showing the stress of operating at the edge of their design parameters. Aragorn, who had been coordinating the combined forces of Gondor and Rohan at the Anduin crossing with the authority of someone who had been born to a responsibility and had spent a lifetime becoming worthy of it, felt the change in the enemy's behavior before any report reached him and immediately recognized it for what it was. Not victory, not even close, but a window. A moment when the enemy was not fully what it had been a moment before. A moment of the kind that wars are decided in, when the side that is paying attention acts, and the side that is adjusting to something unexpected discovers that the adjustment took longer than the available time. He raised Anduril and the blade caught a light that was not quite the light of the afternoon sun, something older and cleaner, and more specific about what it was for. He gave the order to advance across the Anduin with the entire combined force, the crossing that should have been impossible against an intact Tyranid line being possible now against a line that was stumbling in its coordination, and the Free Peoples of Middle-earth answered his order with the specific quality of response that people give when the one giving the order is someone they would follow into exactly this kind of thing. The elves sang as they fought, which was their way, the song not decorative but functional, each voice adding to the world's resonance in the way that a choir adds to the resonance of a space designed for singing, the specific frequencies matching the frequencies of what the Valar were doing above and amplifying them in the local environment. The Tyranid organisms nearest the elvish warriors found themselves fighting in a space where the world itself was vibrating at frequencies that their biology was not designed to inhabit comfortably. They were not defeated by the singing, but they were troubled by it in ways that made them fractionally slower and fractionally less coordinated and fractionally more vulnerable than the Hive Mind's engineering had intended them to be. Fractions matter in battles of this scale. The Ents pushed from the north. The riders of Rohan pressed from the west. The forces of Gondor crossed the Anduin from the south. And from the east, emerging from the forest of Mirkwood in numbers that no one had expected because no one had known they were gathering, came the remaining elves of that ancient wood, moving with the light-footed certainty of those for whom this forest had been home for the entirety of its existence, and who had decided that if it was to be consumed today, it would be consumed over their permanent presence. The battle that followed lasted 3 days. It was not a clean victory. Clean victories are things that happen in stories told long after the fact by people who were not present. The actual event was chaos and blood and loss and moments of extraordinary courage that no one would remember because the people who witnessed them did not survive to report. Them and moments of failure that everyone would try to forget because failure in the middle of survival is something that the survivors carry quietly rather than speaking of. The Tyranid organisms on the ground were cut off from full Hive Mind connection and were therefore less than they were designed to be, but less than they were designed to be was still more than most things that opposed them could easily manage. They fought with the mechanical purposefulness of systems following the last instructions they had fully received, which were to consume, and they pursued that instruction until the instruction could not be pursued any further because there was nothing left of them to pursue it with. What ended the battle was not a final charge or a heroic sacrifice or a moment of inspiration that turned the tide. It was attrition applied with the specific intelligence of peoples who understood their land and used it. The Tyranids consumed what they could reach and were prevented from reaching more by a combination of terrain and Entish resistance, and the world's fundamental refusal to simply be consumed without pushing back. The organisms ran out of what they needed to maintain themselves before they ran out of opposition. And the Hive Mind above, still struggling against Varda's light and unable to send reinforcements through a void that had become hostile in ways it could not compensate for, calculated the engagement's outcome and made the only calculation available to something that does not have pride and does not have attachment and does not have any investment in the specific organisms it has deployed. The fleet began to turn away, not defeated. The Hive Mind was not capable of defeat in the sense that implies finality. It was redirected. It had encountered a world that cost more to consume than it was worth. A calculation that required the specific quality of loss that the Hive Mind had never applied to a single world before, but that the mathematics of its imperative could accommodate if the loss was sufficient. The loss here was sufficient. The world pushed back in ways that no biological engineering had prepared for. The shadow had been stressed in ways that required recovery. The organisms deployed had been consumed without consuming enough to justify their consumption. The fleet moved on. In the silence after the fleet's departure, which arrived slowly because the free peoples of Middle-earth had learned through long experience to distrust silences that might not be genuine, the world began the process of recovery that worlds engage in after catastrophes. The land that had been consumed was genuinely consumed, the northern reaches of runes stripped to the bedrock and beyond by a process that had been operating at a level of thoroughness that no natural disaster had previously approached. The creatures lost were lost. The people who had died in the initial advance before anyone had understood what they were facing had died without understanding why, which was its own kind of tragedy. But the world had not been consumed. Treebeard stood on the edge of what had been the northern forests and looked at what remained with the expression of someone who has lived long enough to have seen forests destroyed before and who knows with the specific certainty of long experience that forests grow back, that the world is patient in ways that appetite is not patient, that what has the capacity to grow will always outlast what has only the capacity to consume. Gandalf stood at the edge of the Anduin watching the last of the Tyranid organisms on the southern bank succumb to what the world had been doing to them since the moment they arrived, which was making them pay a price for every moment of their presence that gradually exceeded the price they could sustain, and he thought about what he had learned. He would carry this knowledge with him for as long as knowledge needed to be carried. The universe was larger than Middle-earth had known. There were things in it that did not participate in the drama of good and evil, that were simply processes unfolding according to their own imperatives, and the encounter with such things required understanding that the drama of good and evil, for all its genuine stakes and genuine heroism, was happening in a context that extended beyond its own horizon. Aragorn looked at the work remaining. The North would need to be settled again, slowly, by people willing to return to land that had been stripped of everything that made it familiar and rebuild it from the beginning. The creatures lost in the initial days before anyone understood would need to be mourned properly. The Entish forests would need centuries of growth to return to what they had been. The free peoples who had fought together across the Anduin would need to decide what they had learned about each other and how that learning changed the relationships between them going forward. He looked at the sky, which was beginning to show the first stars of evening, the stars that elves had mapped with immortal patience, the fixed points in a world where so much else had proven treacherous. The stars looked back with the specific quality of things that have always known more than they were asked, and had been waiting for the world below them to ask.